This is the book Notes on the History of Slavery in Massachusetts by George H. Moore, librarian of the New York Historical Society and correspondent member of the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm going to read right here in chapter 1. It says, we find the earliest records of the history of slavery in Massachusetts at the period of the Pequot War, a few years after the Puritan settlement of the colony. Prior to that time, an occasional offender against the laws was punished by being sold into slavery or adjudged to servitude. Okay? American Indians, they're talking about. But the institution first appears clearly, distinctly in the enslaving of Indians captured in war. We may hereafter add a sketch of the theories which were held to justify the bondage of the heathen, but at present limit ourselves to the collection of facts to illustrate our general subject. And at the outset, we desire to say that in this history there is nothing to comfort pro-slavery men anywhere. The stains which slavery has left on the proud escutcheon, even of Massachusetts, are quite as significant of its hideous character as the satanic defiance of God and humanity which accompanied the laying of the cornerstone of the slaveholders' confederacy. The story of the extermination of the Pequots is well known. It was that warlike tribe who, in the early months of that fatal year, 1637, were reported by Governor Winslow to Winthrop as follows. The Pequots follow their fishing and planting as if they had no enemies. Their women of esteem and children are gone to Long Island with a strong guard at Pequot. They process there, you shall find them. And as they were there born and bred, there their bones shall be buried and rot in the spite of the English. But if the Lord be on our side, their brags will soon fall. All right, this is what they're saying, praying for the Indians to fall. The extracts which follow explain themselves and hardly require comment. Roger Williams, writing from Providence in June 1637 to John Winthrop, says, I understand it would be very grateful to our neighbors that such Pequots as fall to them be not enslaved, like those which are taken in war, but as they say is their general custom, be used kindly, have houses and goods and fields given them, because they voluntarily chose to come into them, and if not received will go to the enemy or turn wild Irish themselves. They'll turn into wild Irish, listen to that. But of this more I shall understand. Again, probably in July 1637, it having again pleased the Most High to put into your hands another miserable drove of Adam's degenerate seed. Are they talking about American Indians this way? And our brethren by nature. Our brethren, remember who the Puritans are. I am bold, if I may not offend in it, to request the keeping and bringing up of one of the children. I have fixed mine eye on this little one with the red about his neck, but I will not be peremptory in my choice, but will rest in your loving pleasure for him, or any. That sounds kind of funny to me. Again, probably in 18 September 1637, Sir, concerning captives, pardon my wanted boldness. The scriptures full of mystery and the Old Testament of types. If they have deserted death, this sin to spare. If they have not deserted death, then what punishments? Whether perpetual slavery? I doubt not but the enemy may lawfully be weakened and despoiled of all comfort of wife and children, etc. But I beseech you well wait it after a due time of training up to labor and restraint. They ought not to set free, just so as without danger of adjoining to the enemies. Again, this is how they're talking about the Pequots. This is a tribe from New England, guys, all right? Later in the same year, November 1637, Roger Williams, who had promised certain fugitive slaves to intercede for them, to write that they might be used kindly, fulfilled this promise in a letter to Winthrop, in which, after stating their complaints of ill usage, he adds, my humble desire is that all that have these poor wretches might be exhorted as to walk wisely and usely toward them, so to make mercy eminent for in that attribute the Father of mercy most shines to Adam's miserable offspring. Hugh Peter writes to John Winthrop from Salem in 1637, Mr. Endicott and myself salute you in the Lord Jesus. Jesus! Touch the hijack. We have heard of a dividends of women and children in the bay and would be glad of a share. A young woman or girl and a boy if you think good. I wrote to you for some boys for Bermudas, which I think is considerable. All right, again, they're talking about American Indians being sold as slaves. And as you see, now they're trying to say, hey, let's send them to Bermuda. In this application of Hugh Peter, we have a glimpse of the beginning of the colonial slave trade. Okay? The beginning of the colonial slave trade. It wasn't with Africans. He wanted some boys for the Bermudas, which he thought was considerable. It would seem to indicate that this disposition of captive Indian boys was in accordance with custom, so they did it all the time, and previous practice of the authorities, all right? It was a common thing. At any rate, it is certain that in the Pequot War they took many prisoners, some of these who had been disposed of to particular persons in the country. Winthrop, chapter 1, 232, ran away and being brought in again were branded on the shoulder. In July 1637, Winthrop says, we have now slain and taken in all about 700. All right, 700 in the Pequot War. Oh yeah, we've gone over this before, guys. And those who survive are what? Branded. Again, these are not Africans. We sent 15 of the boys and 2 women to Bermuda by Mr. Pierce, but he, missing it, carried them to Providence Island. All right, we're going to briefly talk about Providence Island again today, an island off the coast of Nicaragua and Costa Rica in between Jamaica and the Caribbean. All right, and that was a colony of the Massachusetts company. The Puritans had a colony there where they were sending American Indians as slaves to work plantations there. And we're going to see what they were calling these particular people, the Pequot, when they were sending them down there to Providence Island. The learned editor of Winthrop's journal, referring to the fact that this proceeding in that day was probably justified by reference to the practice or institution of the Jews, okay, Sephardic Moorish people, who's running the ships, who's really the merchants, very quaintly observes that cruel people never sent prisoners so far. Governor Winthrop, writing to Governor Bradford of Plymouth, 20th of July, 1637, an account of their success against the Pequots. My Lord, great mercies towards us in our prevailing against our enemies, says. The prisoners were divided, some to those of Ye River, the Connecticut colony, and the rest to us. Of these we send the male children to Bermuda by Mr. William Pierce, and ye women and maid children are disposed about in ye tombs. There have now been slain and taken in about 700, okay? Slain, all right? 700 Pequots enslaved. And this is all in their notes, guys. Compare the order for disposing of ye Indian squaws in Mass Records, Volume 1, page 201. Bradford note to the letter quoted above says, of their being sent to Bermuda, but ye were carried to the West Indies. Hubbard, the contemporary historian of the Indian War, says of these captives, of those who were not so desperate or fooling to fail their lives for nothing, but yielded in time, the male children were sent to the Bermudas. Of the females, some were distributed to the English towns. Some were disposed of among the other Indians, to whom they were deadly enemies, as well as to ourselves. A subsequent entry in Winthrop's journal gives us another glimpse of the subject. February 26, 1638. Mr. Pierce in the Salem ship, the Desiree, returned from the West Indies after 7 months. He had been at Providence and brought some cotton and tobacco and negroes, etc., from thence, and salt from Tortugas. He adds to this account that dry fish and strong liquors are the only commodities for those parts. He met there two men of war, set forth by the lords, etc., of Providence, with letters of marque, who had taken diverse prices from the Spaniards and many Negroes. Long afterwards, Dr. Belknap said of the slave trade that the rum distilled in Massachusetts was the mainspring of this traffic. Jocelyn says that they sent the male children of the Pequots to the Bermudas. This single cargo of women and children was probably not only one sent for the company of Providence Island, and replying from London in 1638, July 3rd, to letters from the authorities in the island, directs special care to be taken of the Cannibal Negroes brought from New England. Sainsbury's Calendar, 1574 to 1660, page 278. We're going to get the primary source later. Again, they're referring to the Pequot American Indian enslaved people as cannibal Negroes. Okay? Do you see that? Body bag for the illusion. So what are you talking about when you're saying Negroes? And all these wills. Oh, I give my Negro to, you know, a lot of those are American Indians. And a lot of those are also some of the black European indentured servants that they had there, calling them so-called Negroes too. Continues, says that in 1639, when the company feared that the number of the Negroes might become too great to be managed, the authorities thought they might be sold and sent to New England or Virginia. The ship Desiree was a vessel of 120 tons built at Marblehead in 1636, one of the earliest built in the colony. In the Pequot War, some of the Narragansetts joined the English in its prosecution and received a part of the prisoners as slaves. The Narragansett enslaved some of the Pequots. They were allies to the English for their services. Miantu Nomo received 80. Ninigret was to have 20. Mather says of the principal engagement, the captives that were taken were about 180, which were divided between the two colonies, and they intended to keep them as servants, but they could not endure the joke, for few of them continued any considerable time with their masters. All right, they probably ran away. Captain Stoughton, who assisted in the work of exterminating the Pequots, after his arrival in the enemy's country, wrote to the governor of Massachusetts, Winthrop, as follows: by this penance you shall receive 48 or 50 women and children, concerning which there is one I formerly mentioned, that is the fairest and largest that I saw amongst them, to whom I have given a coat to clothe her. It is my desire to have her for a servant, if it may stand with your good liking, else not. There is a little squaw that steward Kulakut desirous, to whom he has given a coat. All right, they literally are saying, I want to keep this woman right here. She's very fair or beautiful, right? The fairest, the most beautiful. You know what they're going to do with them, right? Lieutenant Davenport also desireth one, to wit, a small one that has 3 strokes upon her stomach, thus, all right, and the marks. He desires her if it will stand with your liking. Solomon, the Indian, desireth a young little squaw, which I know not. So again, that's how they're distributing the Pequot Indians of New England, and again, referring to them as cannibal Negroes.
So as it says here, forging new communities, Indian slavery and servitude in colonial New England, 1676-1776, by Bernard J. Lillis, class of 2012. This is a thesis submitted to the faculty of the Wesleyan University in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Bachelor of Arts with Department Honors in History, April 2012. In light of the general native practice, particularly following the devastating epidemics of the early 17th century, of fully incorporating captives into native kingship networks and communities, Williams then proposes that given the danger of the Pequot might be false to the English, it would be best if they be settled on some island, using an island which Mayantonomo would have been familiar with off the coast of New England as an example. So they're saying again, they're correlating how rebellious the Pequot are, and having them too close might be dangerous in their native land. So what they did, they decided is to send them off far away or to another island The islands which William must have had in mind and where in fact a number of Pequot captives were sent were the British slave colonies in the Caribbean, Bermuda, or the short-lived Puritan slave colony of Providence Island. This makes Mayan Tonomo's agreement on the basis that shipping slaves out of New England would prevent them from having to break up their families tragically ironic. By the end of July, at least one shipment of 17 Pequot captives had been sent to the West Indies on the ship Desiree. In 1638, the Desiree returned after a 7-month voyage bringing cotton, tobacco, salt, and African slaves. Dodge the hijack. They could not endure that joke. The Captivity of the Pequot Women and Children after the War of 1637 by Michael L. Fix, the New England Quarterly Journal article, volume 73, number 1, March 2000, pages 58 to 81. And jump into this part of the journal. It says, after the swamp battle, he reported in his journal the English forces had captured and killed about 700 Pequots. Earlier, he had noted the deaths of about 400 Pequots. The resultant estimate of 300 living captive Pequots conforms to the combined totals 319 reported by the various chroniclers of the war. The colonists quickly transported one captive to England and 17 more to Providence Island over in Nicaragua, Caribbean. So on the bottom of this page, on the footnote, from what we just read, it says, Winthrop Journal, colonial authorities intended to send these captives to Bermuda. Instead, a navigational error resulted in their delivery to Providence Island. Ethel Bossivane claims that Pequots were shipped to Bermuda in 1640 and after 1650. In drawing this conclusion, she relies on the works of James E. Smith and Van Wyck Mason. However, Mason and Smith failed to provide any specific documentation of Pequot slavery in Bermuda. They only cite sources that contain references to Indians of unknown and non-New England origins. So it says, see Bossavane, whatever became of the New England Indians shipped to Bermuda to be sold as slaves. So what happened to these New England Indians that were shipped to Bermuda? They ended up in Providence Island. In chapter 2, The First Slaves, an artist's rendering of a scene at the 1937 massacre of the Pequot Ford and Mystic River, and that's in Massachusetts. As you can see, what they did to them. So let's see what chapter 2 of this book says. It says, out of a swampy thicket near the blue waters of Long Island Sound, 200 old men, women, and children stepped into the bright sunshine and entered a new world. Hundreds of edgy soldiers, mustered from villages and farms across Connecticut, had finally surrounded the Pequots and their leader, Sasaku. So it says finally, they were having trouble with these Pequots, Indians. Critical day in the Pequot War that had consumed Puritan Connecticut for several years. So you hear, they were having trouble with these Pequot rebels for several years. 6 weeks before, in a key victory for the colonists, Captain John Mason had led a massacre of the Pequot Fort and Mystic, killing as many as 700 Indians in a single hour. Tragic. This summer afternoon was a jubilant one for the Puritans and their Mohegan scouts who had cornered these most terrible Pequots, most terrible to them because they were having trouble with them, right? They were getting murdered by them. A new chapter in American history was about to begin. Indian enslavement in colonial America. All right, you hear that? A new chapter in American history, the enslavement of the Indians. Among the Pequots caught in the bog in what's now part of Fairfield, a group of perhaps 17 most likely children were thought to have been exported as slaves. Others were handed out to soldiers as wartime booty. Historians believe that these 17 Pequot later ended up on an island off of Nicaragua. Boom, there you go. Like many of the Indian slaves sent from America over the next century, there is little record of what happened to them. All right, so little record of what happened to them, or they don't want us to correlate. This island off the coast of Nicaragua where they're talking about is actually Providence Island. We know that already. And the Providence Island had Pequot slaves, and it was attacked in 1641 by Spanish, and the Puritans with their Pequot slaves went over to Gracias a Dios and became intermingled supposedly with the Mosquito natives, or enslaved some more there because the Mosquitoes were loyal to the English crown, as we know, and helped them enslave other Native Americans by the thousands. Continuing, it says, barely 5 years after their first recorded contact with Europeans, this final battle of the bloody Pequot War conclusively finished a doomed experiment by Indians and Puritans to live side by side. By the time the Treaty of Hartford was signed the following September, formally ending the war, the English had killed or enslaved more than 1,500 Pequot men, women, and children, scholars believe. During the uneasy decades that followed, as the Puritans pushed deeper into Indian country and their numbers swelled, it was difficult to travel through Connecticut, Massachusetts, or Rhode Island and not encounter an Indian slave. All right, again, not encounter an Indian slave working in a field, orchard, or boat yard, or in a plantation or a boat yard. By the end of the 1600s, there were probably thousands of Indian slaves, many of them servants in home and on farms, indentured servitude. It would become, in the words of Roger Williams, a founder of Brown University, an essential component of the unnecessary wars and cruel destructions of the Indians in New England. The Pequot are a great example how they were enslaved and later on taken to another place where from there in historical accounts they are called Africans. All right, so all of a sudden they became Africans, but we see this is indigenous people, not from Africa. Here in this book, Brethren by Nature, New England Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery. The rapid entry of Indians into the labor market in other English colonies in the late 1620s and the 1630s exposed this gap. The anomalous status of Indians as laboring groups that occupied a legal gray area between servants of European origins and African slaves attracted attention, and legislation a year before the Pequot conflict. In Barbados and Providence Island, Providence Island, right? Two colonies with close ties to New England. Pequot and Manisean captives exported out of New England in the 1630s entered an Atlantic world where Indians already composed a significant proportion of the agriculture and public works and infrastructure labor force. Continuing says they joined Caribs and Arawaks. So they're talking about the Pequot and the Manisean. They joined Caribs and Arawaks from the Caribbean islands, Guyana and Venezuela, Mosquitoes, and members of smaller groups raided by the Mosquitoes from Central America, and Indians from northern Mexico and South America traded through Gracias de Dios, a port on the coast between present-day Nicaragua and Honduras that we just mentioned. It says Indian captives from this western rim region also moved to and through Jamaica, which served as a hub of the region's labor market. By the 1640s, the Dutch in New York and the English in Virginia exported Indian captives to Curaçao, Bermuda, and Barbados. On the Puritan colony of Providence Island, organized by many of the same figures who backed the Massachusetts Bay Company, despite early efforts to limit African slavery and to prohibit Indian slavery, the slave population exploded after 1634, and slaves outnumbered English colonists by the end of the decade. Providence Island Company officials and investors differed somewhat on the length and heritability of slave status. Once eminent counselor named Samuel Richworth, who supported the rights of the English servants against company and planter exploitation, also attacked slavery vehemently as incompatible with godly aims and encouraged slaves to rebel. But in practice, by 1634, most planters expected slaves to work for life and claimed ownership of the children of non-European workers, again a crucial distinction between slavery and servitude. Such was the demand for labor that despite two major slave revolts and the presence of restive Maroon community, the government refused to let inhabitants who left the island for any reason take enslaved workers with them because they were needed for construction of public defense projects as well as agricultural work. A Captain Bell did receive permission to sell his plantation and leave with his Indian woman, wife, and Negroes in 1638. Possibly Bell's Indian was a New England captive. In one of the only surviving documents that mentions the Pequots in May 1638, the company's officials warned the governor of Providence Island that we would have the Cannibal Negroes from New England inquired after, whose they are and special care taken of them. So first of all, they're saying that there's an official document that mentions that the Pequot in 1638, they were in Providence Island. They were being sent there. If we know the story of the Pequot War with the English and the Puritans, we see that they after they had lost, they were enslaved and sent to the West Indies in the South. They were sent to other colonies of English colonies. So it says here that we would have the Cannibal Negroes from New England. They said that they need to be taken care of because if you know the stories of the Pequots, they were really rebellious. They wouldn't go down without a fight. They never ceased to fight. And just in case if you didn't capture that, they're referring to the Pequots as Cannibal Negroes, right? They call them the Pequots Negroes. So who's really arriving to the Mosquito Coast? Who were these slaves? Africans, so-called, right? They were Pequots. So it says, but given slave unrest, these worries seem excited by security concerns rather than humanitarian ones. Company and island officials were worried about the captives fomenting rebellion or forging relationships with existing Indian and Maroon communities. This is the first mention of what would become a stereotype in English Atlantic Caribbean correspondence and legislation in the 17th century, that New England Indians were particularly troublesome and prone to rebellion. No direct evidence that the Pequots or later the Wampanoag or Narragansetts were involved in slave revolts or rebellion has appeared in colonial records. Yet these official concerns resurfaced in the 1640s and the 1670s in times of slave revolt and insecurity. So again, you can see that they were having trouble keeping these Pequot tribal native aboriginals in check, and they were fighting to the end, even in their slave colonies down there in Providence Island. The diaspora of Indians out of New England followed the patterns of New England's trade routes and partners, which linked the region closely to Bermuda, Virginia, Barbados, Providence Island, and eventually Jamaica. So again, Providence Island. After the English conquest, colonies where slavery flourished by the 1640s. Within a few years, these networks included the Canaries, the Azores, Madeira, and Cape Verde, and ports on the Mediterranean, as New England ships took barrels, staves, and fish and local Indians. They took local Indians to these places in Cape Verde, Mediterranean, Canaries, Azores, and Madeira, says, to trade for wine, which they in turn exchanged for Africans on the Guinea coast in Barbados. Captain Powell, who ferried Henry Winthrop to and from Barbados, was a Puritan who battled against Stuart sympathizers in Barbados and also transported European laborers and eventually Africans and Indians to the island as workers, including the original Guyanese Arawak.
We're going to read from the primary source where they admit they are enslaving Pequot Indians and reclassifying them. It says here, Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series. This is Volume 1, America and West Indies. This is notes from 1574 to 1660, preserved in the State Paper Department of Her Majesty's Public Record Office. Okay, this is what we're about to get into. This one right here is from 1860, but again, what we're going to read is from the 1600s. So I'm going to page 277. Okay, and I scroll down. Again, these are all different notes, different dates. All right, as you guys see here, it says here on July 3rd, the Company of Providence Island. There we go again, Providence Island. You already know the whole story, right? To the Governor and Council, has received their letter of the 27th of December with others from the inhabitants, are very sensible of the want of ministers, who have been discouraged by the planters not contributing to their maintenance. Hope to send two by the next ship. Complain of the discontinuance of magazines answered. Leave to trade with the Dutch. Instructions instructions restraining men from leaving Providence interpreted. We never intended to make the island a prison to any men. A council house to be built cannot as yet send tiles and bricks. Captains Axe and Carter appointed councilors. The former marshal was found fault with as a condemned man, but being pardoned, he may be continued in that place. Directions for preventing disorders by removing from old plantations, cotton to be chiefly regarded as more valuable than tobacco. Also, stores of oranges and lemons to be planted. Again, we're talking about a letter from the Company of Providence Island in Providence Island. This is in 1638. Okay, 1638, June 3rd. A council of war established. Dislike of Captain Newman's permitting the Spaniards to view the passages of the island, have endeavored to furnish gunners. John Sudbury to be encouraged to remain. Agreement with the armorer to be performed. Persons running away from the island to be punished by the council of war. Taking in of Negroes excused. Danger of too great a number. Hope shortly to send 200 English to be exchanged for as many Negroes. Listen to what they're saying. To 2 Englishmen and a family. So they're trying to exchange English servants or slaves for Negroes. To 2 English men and a family, 1 Negro may be received, and no more for whom 40 pounds of tobacco per head is to be paid. Reasons: Negroes contribute a double proportion to the works. Special care to be taken of the cannibal Negroes brought from New England. All right, here is the main source. They're calling who? Pequot Indians. Who are these people being brought from New England and Providence Island, guys? It wasn't Africans. Pequot Indians. We got the whole drop. So when they're saying 200 English exchange for Negroes, what Negroes? Again, cannibal Negroes brought from New England. They're just talking about American Indians. Reclassified them, literally, paper genocide, rewrote the stories, told us in school it was Africans that they were bringing to all these West Indian islands, and we know better now. If you guys have watched all the parts of this series, The Real Slave Trade, you see who they were enslaving and bringing into the West Indies. A lot of American Indians, a lot of Black Europeans, and many of the Southeast Asians. I brought this information out about 3 or 4 years ago. This should have really ended all the debates and all the Afrocentric, Pan-African views. Because if they call these people cannibal Negroes, how many times did they actually do this throughout history where they're reclassifying American Indians? We've proven in this series alone that it happened many times. All right. Again, make sure to catch the full series from part 1 all the way to part 4. Again, we're in part 5 today. Make sure to watch the ones previous to this, especially if you're still holding on to old, indoctrinated, Afrocentric, Pan-African beliefs and whitewash histories. There's a real history there for you to learn if you're really willing to learn truth and let go and empty your cup. For a little bonus dismount, we're going to go out with Princess Natasha of the Eastern Pequot clan. Hear what she has to say about her people.
On October 12, 2005, the United States government said we ceased to exist. Gone, kaput. Just like that, a figment of your imagination. Another native tribe wiped from the history books. And this is our story. Celebrating. They were celebrating while my heart was cold. It was like a blizzard had swept my entire body. They were celebrating. That day they created and embraced us with his warmth, but instead left us frozen, feeling his bitter teardrops. They were celebrating while I sat there, twisting and turning, mesmerized by the idea of federal recognition. They were celebrating while the elders were sick and hopeless, and the youth were uninspired and suffering ambition. They were celebrating while there was little concern in the air. We knew we were a tribe, and we had existed since the beginning of time. They were celebrating as we played honor songs to mourn the loss of our poor warriors. They were celebrating while the drum pounded like a bold fist, fighting its way into the ears, fighting its way into my ears like the struggle of my people. They were celebrating. While I passed that red house with the red mailbox, my nerves were already tied in knots. The road and all its cracky imperfections did little to grant forgiveness. They were celebrating. While I could see the fire lit and members of our tribe huddled around its burning flame. They were celebrating while we had hoped the past frustrations and attempts at recognition would be wiped clean, a new dawn for my people. They were celebrating while that fax came down and they destroyed us with a single mark of a pen. They were celebrating while history had repeated itself and the government had wiped out another powerful nation. They were celebrating while I looked at my people everywhere in tears, sad that their day of recognition passed by with a colorblind eye. They were celebrating while after all these years nothing had changed. The white man continued to speak with a forked tongue. They were celebrating October 12, 2005, Columbus Day, while we were left dead on Lantern Hill. They were celebrating while Attorney General Richard Blumenthal stated this was the greatest day in United States history. Those words burned like salt in a wound. They were celebrating the day I learned to hate. But one day we will celebrate. Our time will come to achieve our federal recognition and help deliver our official identity, a wounded, rich, and proud people. Thank you.
Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow.